So interestingly, Northrop Frye uses the analogy of taste for criticism, and it's a very gastronomic metaphor related to food. So he compares the critic to an astral gourmet. Gourmet is someone who enjoys, who is a connoisseur of good things, and who uses their taste, their sense of taste to decide whether something is good or bad. So the critic is a gourmet, but what kind of a gourmet? The critic is an astral gourmet. What do we mean by astral gourmet? Astral is when you move out of your body. So it's like an out of body experience, because the literary work is like disembodied cookery. So it is not actually cooked food, right? It's like some disembodied food which does not have a body, which does not have a material reality. It's at a more sublime level. So, and the critic tastes the literary work, and then the critic decides, oh, it's like this, and it needs a little bit of this, and I think it's too much of this. So it's almost like a refined gourmet speaking, right? And when the critic pronounces their judgment, when they say something needs this work, it's lacking here, and it needs something here. So what they are also implying is how better they are, how superior they are, how refined the critic is, because it is the critic who can pass that judgment on a literary text, right? So it is like doing the job of a wine taster. Not everybody can taste wine, or it is like doing the job of someone who tastes tea or tastes coffee, to find out the subtle differences. So the critic is like that. So the critic acquires a very socially superior position as compared to the reader. And Northrop Frye is not too happy about that, because he says taste leads to a specific judgment. Uh, so here what happens is the critic becomes the judge. And the assumption that underlies such criticism is usually that the test of one's critical ability is a value judgment on the literary work. So when the critic says, "Mm, it's too much of this, and too little of this," the critic is passing a value judgment. So now, to extend the food metaphor only, for example, say there's a dish in front of you, and these five-star restaurants, they have the top chefs, right? They hire top chefs. You may have seen in those food reality shows also, right? Like MasterChef, that they have these exotic dishes laid out. Now the thing is, that when the judge tastes it, the judge will say, okay, it has got the right texture, and it has got the right look, and there's a bit of salt, and there's a bit of sweet, and there's a bit of tanginess, so everything is in proportion. So the judge is giving a very refined judgment on a particular text, but particular item that has been cooked. But maybe when it is the judge who is doing it, but if you serve it to someone who has to eat it, that person's experience can be different from the judge's experience, right? Because the judge is offering a very expert kind of that judgment is coming from an area of expertise, whereas the proof of the pudding lies in eating it, as they say. So the proof of how good the food is finally going to be decided by its popularity and whether people will eat it. So if I eat it and I feel, according to the judge, it is perfect, but I like food that is spicy, I won't like it, right? So the judge can't dictate my experience. So in a similar way, the critic can't dictate the reader's experience. And because I am just an ordinary eater, and I think, oh my God, if the judge has said that this is very good food, I should also agree. So that is what also happens in the realm of literature. That even if a reader experiences something different after reading a literary text, the reader is forced to accept the views of the critic, because the critic enjoys a socially superior status. So the reader thinks, I don't know enough, maybe. So maybe I should just keep my keep quiet and just listen to the critic. And that is where the subjective experience of literature stops. And this is what Northrop Frye's whole problem with criticism is. And then he goes on to talk about the first problem and then the second problem. So it's very interesting. And I think I've mentioned this earlier also, that the first problem is that Northrop Frye objects to the X is a failure because formula. So no poet, no writer can be a failure because the moment you say because, this is a reflection of a pseudo critical moral anxiety. And he actually goes on to prove this, substantiate his objection by comparing Matthew Arnold's criticism of a poem, Empedocles on Etna. So Matthew Arnold criticizes this poem, saying this poem does not have any action. It's only suffering, and it's only in the mind, and the suffering does not translate into action. So there's no action in the poem. That is Matthew Arnold's criticism for this particular work. Now, if you look at T.S. Eliot's poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, there is no action in it. It's only suffering and suffering and suffering. And yet, it is one of the most popular poems of T.S. Eliot, which was accepted by readers. So then how do you justify? So if Matthew Arnold's statement about the first work has to be true, then if we start applying the same template on Eliot's poem, then Eliot's poem is a failure, but that's not the case. People have liked it. So obviously, so and so poet is a failure because this formula does not work. That's the first problem with criticism, and that is what critics mostly try to say. They are always trying to say how Mr. X or Miss X, who is a poet in a particular capacity, how their poem or their work is inferior because, or it is not as great as that person's poem because. So he says this because comes from a pseudo critical moral anxiety. This is the critic's own anxiety. It has got nothing to do with the work. The second problem, he says, is a bad poem or novel is one in which, so the critic feels, a potential literary experience has not been actualized. Such a judgment implies a consensus. So the critic feels, there was some kind of experience which the poet or the writer was trying to give, but it never reached that stage where it could be experienced. So it never got actualized. But here, when the critic is passing this judgment, the critic is obviously speaking for everybody, right, from a position of power. So it means that the critic is implying that everyone, we have all reached a consensus. Consensus is mutual agreement that yes, we all think that there was no actualization of the literary experience. So this cannot be true because it is the critic's subjective opinion. How can the critic speak for everybody else? So, and what if the critic is wrong? So an actualized work of literature may still fail to become an actualized experience for its reader. So sometimes if the critic says, oh, this particular work is great because the literary experience is actualized. But how do you know? It may have actualized for you. Maybe for some other reader, it did not actualize. So you cannot speak on behalf of the reader. That is what Northrop Frye is trying to say. Because and the second point he brings up is judicial criticism. So this kind of value judgment, this kind of treatment of a literary text as if you're a judge sitting to evaluate or judge a particular literary text, it's called judicial criticism. So what is the problem or the limitation of judicial criticism? That it is a slave to historic variables. Historic variables means historic elements are going to change from time to time, and most of the time judicial criticism takes into account the external historic framework. and tries to contextualize a literary text within that historical space or the historical time, and decide the worth of the text. But that is going to vary from time to time, right? So if I read Daffodils today, it is going to be a different experience. Now, someone who may have read it 100 years ago would have had a different experience. So one universal criticism is not going to work for everybody, because a literary text is subject to criticism is subject to historic variables, and therefore it cannot give you that authentic experience of a text. Uh, and lastly, he says all methods of criticism and teaching, because he equates criticism to teaching, right? Northrop Frye. He says when you are teaching literature, you're not teaching literature, you're teaching about literature, which means you are actually engaging in criticism of a literary text. So he says all methods of criticism and teaching are bad. They are bad. He calls it outright bad if they encourage the persisting separation of the student and the literary work. So, if criticism is encouraging a separation, a dichotomy between the student and the literary work, it is really a bad template of criticism. And all criticism is good if it teaches how to overcome this dichotomy, how to overcome this separation and be one with the text. So that is primarily the crux of his argument. Right. Okay, he continues with the problem. Uh, so he says in teaching manual skills such as car driving, an examination can test the skill on the higher level. But an examination in English literature cannot pass beyond the level of theoretical knowledge. We may guess the quality of a student's literary experience from the quality of the student's writing, but there is no assured way of telling from the outside the difference between a student who knows literature and a student who merely knows about literature. So he says the examination is also not the perfect way of assessing a student's understanding of literature, because it is very easy to deceive the examiner, and it's very difficult to tell the difference between someone who knows literature, who experiences it firsthand, who experiences it through all their senses, and someone who has merely studied about it and who is reproducing the knowledge that they have studied. Right? So, so again, he is insisting that the object of literary experience, so if it's a poem or a text or a story or an essay, it has to be placed directly in front of the student. And the student should be urged to respond to it then and there and accept no substitutes as the end of that understanding. So the student needs to engage with it then and there, and the student needs to respond to that particular piece. Uh, and he says it does not matter at all what a student thinks and feels about literature until he can think and feel, which is not until he passes the stage of stock response. So, for the student, the journey starts with stock response. Stock response means everyone giving the same response to a poem, for example. Every student saying the same thing. That's the first stage. The second stage is the student has to think and feel. The student has to ask himself or herself, what am I feeling? What is my response? And that is the experience, that just because three other people are saying this is very good. So it's like going to a restaurant and getting to hear about the food that is being served and then repeating it and then saying, oh, the food is very good, but I have not tasted it. Just because my friends are saying and my friends have eaten it, or my teacher has eaten it, my teacher is saying the food is very good and I'm repeating what my teacher has said, but I have not eaten it firsthand. So he says you eat it firsthand and you respond, you give your feedback directly, you enjoy it, you experience it, you live in that experience. And he urges us to understand this, that there is no real meaning in literature. No literary text has any real, central, universal meaning. Nothing to be got out of it or abstracted from the total experience. And yet, all criticism seems to be concerned only about such kind of a meaning that will go to the central meaning, or that will go to take it to extract some abstract concept out of it. He says this does not make sense at all, right? Because there is no real meaning in a text. The meaning is what the reader gives to it. Hmm. And very interestingly, he gives a message to English teachers. Uh, and so he says, I wish all teachers of English at every level could feel that they were concerned with the whole of a student's verbal or, in fact, imaginative experience, not merely with a small part of it that is conventionally called literary. The incessant verbal bombardment that students get from conversation, advertising, the mass media, or even such verbal games as Scrabble or crossword puzzles is addressed to the same part of the mind that literature addresses. And it does far more to mold their literary imagination than poetry or fiction. So he says, I wish English teachers didn't have such a narrow understanding of literature. They didn't look at literature only as classics, or only as poetry, or only as novels. And they understood literature for their students as the whole gamut of verbal experience. Be it then the student, in today's times, I will say, be it then the student reading something on social media, or the student texting, or using WhatsApp, or using, say, a voice messenger, or things like that, or reading a blog, or reading an ad. All of that appeals to the same part of the mind as poetry or fiction, and therefore literature teachers have to broaden their understanding of literary experience or literature. It is the literature teachers who have narrowed it down, who behave like pedants, who behave very in a very superior manner, and who will not allow who will not acknowledge this gamut of verbal experience or literary experience, and who will not acknowledge that perhaps these other kinds of experiences are far more impactful than poetry or fiction can ever be. New developments in literature meet with resistance merely because they bring to life conventions that the critics had decided were subliterary. So he says there are new developments in literature, there are new genres of literature, but they meet with a lot of resistance. People, they meet with a lot of opposition simply because they are bringing new conventions. They are breaking the tradition, and they are bringing in new conventions which the critics do not consider worthwhile, and which the critics think are sub-literary. That's Northrop Frye's take on and his message to the English teachers. And he says the problem is that the critic is deeply concerned with evaluation and with separating the good from the bad in literature, but there is no good and bad in literature. All literature is experience. Because the moment you say this is good and this is bad, you are coming from a morally superior ground. It is like life, because literature is a reflection of life. So you can't say, just like in life, you can't say that this is good and this is bad, because everything is about experience. Similarly, in literature also, you cannot say this is good and this is bad, because everything is about experience. The area of literature should not be restricted to the conventionally literary. I think I've spoken about this, but expanded to the entire area of verbal experience. We just saw it in the previous slide. And he says, if I'm right in saying that literature is a power to be possessed, if literature is a power to be possessed and not a body of objects to be studied, then the difference between good and bad is not something inherent in literary works themselves, but the difference between two ways of using literary experience. So he says no work, no literary text, no poem, nothing is inherently good or bad, just like in life. You know, there's nothing, or in this world there is nothing inherently good or bad. We attribute good or bad qualities depending on on the way we experience it, right? So if we were, because we invest our moral understanding of things, our cultural understanding of things in it, and that is why we say this is bad, this is good. So suppose um, my car breaks down. Okay, I'm driving and my car breaks down, and I'm standing on the road for an hour. I say, oh, I had a very bad experience. But that is me saying that I had a bad experience because I think it is bad. There is nothing inherently bad about it, right? My car broke down, so I have to go somewhere, reach somewhere, and I couldn't reach there. That's why it becomes bad for me. But otherwise there is nothing inherently bad in it. I could have turned it into a good experience also. Say if it had broken down, and suddenly I had chanced upon my long lost friend of 20 years who had been coming from the other direction, and we had suddenly started talking and catching up, then the same experience would become a very good experience. So it is, so nothing, no event, no literary text is inherently good or bad. It is our experience, the way we understand it, the way we feel about it, that makes it good or bad, right? So the belief that good and bad can be determined as inherent qualities is the belief that inspires censorship and the attempt to establish grades and hierarchies in literature itself. So because critics believe that, oh, this is bad and this is good, that is why they come up with censorship, that such and such things should be censored and such things should be shown. Why? Because I am applying my moral template to it. It is not inherently good or bad, right? And then once I apply my moral template, my cultural template to it, I censor it, and then when something is censored it becomes bad. And then that leads to the whole idea of grading works. So one work is superior to the other work, and that creates a hierarchy. And very interestingly, Northrop Frye says no literary text can be good or bad. No literary text can have a good or a bad impact. Let us say man is defiled, polluted, not by what goes into him, but by what comes out of him. So I won't get spoiled or polluted by what goes into me, but definitely how that is going to impact me and what actions I give as a response, that is going to decide, say, that is going to decide, that is going can be categorized as good or bad. So otherwise, the input doesn't determine good or bad.